Friday. We are in Acts 21. We have reached a turning point in this story. Paul has reached Jerusalem after his 3 missionary journeys, and when he gets there, he finds that the welcome may not actually be all that welcome. He knows that he faces trouble in Jerusalem, but in today's reading, and especially as we get into the reading next week, we're going to see just how unwelcome that reading is. Paul is immediately greeted by the leader of the church in Jerusalem, in James. James comes across on a first read as being happy to see Paul. He wants to hear about what Paul has been doing, but then he gives him the first hint that there may actually be just what Paul suspects, which is trouble in Jerusalem. He explains to Paul that there are some who have viewed his ministry in a bad light, that they believe that he is talking bad about Moses and the law. And so what should Paul do to prove that he is a loyal Jew, that he isn't disregarding the law? Take a Nazarite vow. We've seen Paul do this before. He's going to actually pay for some other men's vows in the temple. And what some would argue is that what James is actually doing is putting Paul in a position where he has to prove his loyalty, which he's more than willing to do. He's not disloyal to the law. But more importantly, to pay for these men, he's going to have to actually go to the temple in the heart of the city. And it's there that the question is, does James do this intentionally because he knows what awaits Paul at the temple? When Paul gets to the temple, he is arrested. There's a violent mob that is stirred up by some rabble-rousers in the crowd, some Jews, and listen to the charge that they levy against him. Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law in this place. This is verse 28 of chapter 21. This is the man who's teaching against the law, against the Jewish people, and specifically against this Jewish temple. And not only that, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. Now, on the surface, this seems kind of like a silly, okay, what does it matter if he brings Greeks into the temple? This is a crime for the Jewish people, punishable by death. If you've ever seen a map of the temple, there's just Google it. There's a court of the Gentiles. That's the last place that the Gentiles can go. They can't go into the central parts of the temple, the courtyards there that were just for the Jews and really just for men. Gentiles weren't allowed in, and to bring a Gentile in is a death sentence. These men are not playing around. They're not just trying to get Paul in trouble. They're trying to get him killed. And this is going to eventually cost Paul his life. They're not here in Jerusalem. Look at what the crowd says to him. He wants to make a case, but he's not going to be allowed to just yet. We'll read about that next week. But in verse 36, the mob of people are following as Paul is being led out of the courtyard by these Roman soldiers. And the crowd is going to be shouting, "Away with him, away with him." The exact same words that the crowd shouted to another man who lived not long before in Jerusalem when they were asked to choose between setting free Jesus of Nazareth or Barabbas, this criminal who was also up for discussion. And the crowd shouted, "Away with him, give us Barabbas." And here we see that same language. It's like what Matt talked about yesterday. Paul, as he continues in his ministry, is starting to look more and more like Jesus. And as he is faithful to the call that the Spirit is placing in his life, it's like he's walking the same footsteps that Jesus walked. He's arrested in the temple. He's brought in, this angry mob is being raised against him, shouting, "Away with him." They're trying to kill him. And what I find the most interesting about this section is, again, what is Paul accused of? Bringing Greeks into the temple. He never did that on a physical level. He never brought these Greeks into the temple. But what is Paul's ministry all about? The temple was the hotspot of God's presence on earth. It represented how people were able to be with God, to be in his presence. It was a sign that God was actually with them, with the Israelites. So what has Paul done through his ministry? He's brought people into God's presence, and not just any people, not just Jews, but Gentiles and Greeks as well. We've read about 2 missionary journeys where he has spent untold years and months in Macedonia, in Greece. Paul may not be guilty of the charge that they're levying at him on a very practical level. He didn't bring Greeks into the temple per se. But Paul has absolutely throughout his ministry been bringing these Greeks and these other Gentiles into the very heart of God's kingdom, into God's presence and into God's family. That's what his whole life has been about. So I see Luke writing this kind of with a smirk on his face, because while these charges aren't, actually true, they're very true in the nature of Paul's life. And I think it's a sign for us, what I've been reflecting on this week as we look at the past 3 journeys of Paul's ministry and everywhere he's gone. It's that we are called to be people who do the exact same thing that Paul is charged with. We are called to be people who see who's on the outside, who's not in, who's not allowed, who doesn't feel comfortable. And those are the very people we are called to bring into the hot spot of God's presence. That doesn't just mean the church, though I do think that we're called to invite people in, to bring people into this place that we call home of HBUMC or wherever your church home is. But more than anything, what we're called to do is show people the God that we worship and to invite them into his presence and invite them into the family of God. This is what the ministry of Paul has been throughout his whole life since his conversion episode earlier in Acts. And it's what we are called to do as well. It's what is going to get Paul killed or at least arrested. From this moment forward in the book of Acts, Paul will not be a free man again. He will either be in prison in chains or he will be under a Roman guard from here on out. This world will not always take kindly to us reaching out and bringing outsiders in, but it's exactly that we are called to do. So how can you do that this week? How can you look around and see who's not a part of God's family, who doesn't feel comfortable being brought into the heat of the temple, so to speak? And how can you extend a hand to them? Amen.